it has long been argued that the Anglo-Saxons were war-making people. Heroic poetry, narrative chronicles, law codes, and burial evidence all emphasize the role of a warrior in Anglo-Saxon culture. As the historian Eric John explains, Anglo-Saxon society was so violent that a central fact of its politics, its way of life even, was fighting and making war. However, when the Danes and Norsemen of the Great Heathen Army arrived upon English shores, they swept through Saxon lands like a firestorm, with only the Kingdom of Wessex providing any meaningful resistance. This begs the question, why did the Saxons, a people historically known for their skill in war, fare so poorly against the invaders in the Viking Age? In this video, we will delve into the historical record and examine the social, political, and technological reasons why most of the English kingdoms fared so poorly against the Northern Tide. Perhaps it was just too easy to plunder places where wealth was being stored. Bulging coin purses make you a target when the Vikings come to town. Well, you won't make their mistake. Take your everyday stuff and slim it down with our sponsor Ridge. First, get the Ridge wallet. It's a compact and stylish wallet that doesn't have to squeeze into your pockets. It's smaller than the smallest wallet we had to compare it to, but it's also super strong, being made of military-grade material and given a lifetime guarantee. Slot in up to 12 cards, add cash using the band and clip if needed, and never look back on the medieval tier leather wallets of old. As for your keys, that's another annoying and messy carry with the usual keyring setups, so streamline it all with the Ridge key case. It's another strong, small gadget with a professional look and space for 6 keys. Easy to use, and again comes with a lifetime guarantee. Plus, the Vikings won't know they need to kill you first to get inside places. All Ridge products have a 99-day money-back guarantee if you don't like them, and you can get them cheaper by using our offer. Go to the link in the description and use code KINGSANDGENERALS to get a 10% discount. The history of Middle and Late Saxon England was shaped by the Viking invasions and the military response of the English kings. Until the autumn of 865, the Vikings who raided England can be considered more as pirates than as territorial rulers. The strategy the Vikings followed up to 865 was to obtain as much wealth as possible with a minimum of risk. Their main targets were the monasteries and churches that held considerable amounts of wealth and were poorly, if at all, defended. It was when a great heathen raiding army overwintered in the Kingdom of East Anglia that the Viking presence in England became much larger. To cite historian Richard Abels, in the autumn and winter of 865, the very nature of the threat changed. The ambitions of the leaders of the Great Heathen Army took on a territorial dimension. The saga of Ragnar Lodbrok mentions that the titular Lodbrok's sons, including Ivar the Boneless and Ubba, attacked the Kingdom of Northumbria, which was ruled by King Aella. Between 865 and 878, every Anglo-Saxon kingdom, with the exception of Wessex, came under control of the Danes, either directly, as in East Anglia, or intermediately through the establishment of native client kings, as in Mercia. Early medieval sources, like the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle and archaeological findings, give us some understanding on how the English were not able to defend themselves against the Vikings. However, one must be aware that historians today cannot examine the Anglo-Saxon reaction to the Danish invasions in full detail, because the dynasties and kingdoms that were defeated by the Vikings left few or no records themselves. In fact, the East Anglian kings of the 9th century are mostly remembered by their names, known only from their coins. This lack of sufficient evidence makes it hard to understand why the Anglo-Saxons failed to defend themselves against the Vikings, or what allowed Wessex to resist where other kingdoms were quashed. Moreover, most surviving written sources from this time were composed by chroniclers from Wessex, who were not too concerned with describing details about the Mercian, East Anglian, or Northumbrian resistances. Ultimately, this lack of sources presents a challenge in understanding why the Anglo-Saxons struggled with the Vikings. To understand why the Anglo-Saxons failed, we first need to understand the threat the Vikings posed. Horses and ships had a foremost importance in the success of Viking raids. Viking longships were fast-sailing vessels that could use oars to support the sails when needed. and made it possible for the Vikings to use islets in shallow estuaries as landing places on English soil, where they could entrench themselves in winter strongholds. In contrast, English ships drew too much water to be able to land in these islets. Another advantage of the Viking ships was their capability to effectively land horses, making it possible for heavily armed cavalry to move off a Danish vessel and swiftly overrun an English fortified position. Prior to 865, Vikings usually concentrated their activities on a particular river basin and used an island site offshore or upriver as a permanent base camp for an upcoming winter, from where they raided coastal and riverine settlements or monasteries. These hit-and-run tactics were effective against the Anglo-Saxons, who were usually not able to organize a defense in time. With the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in 865, these tactics changed. This grand Viking force moved each autumn to a new kingdom or district, where it established a new camp for the following year. The army of 865 did not construct new fortified camps, nor did they sequester themselves in isolated island sites. Instead, they occupied royal and administrative centers in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. These Danish annual camps needed to protect the men, food supplies, their treasure, and their wounded. Therefore, in 865, the Great Heathen Army was designed to be highly mobile and unpredictable, which made it harder for the Anglo-Saxons to react. Political instability was another important reason the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were vulnerable to the Viking invasion, and often it was the Vikings themselves who contributed to the destabilization of the Saxon realms. For example, in 838, Vikings supported the Celtic Britons in Cornwall, who rebelled against their Wessex overlords, while in 844, a deposed Northumbrian king was restored to power after his usurper was defeated and killed by Viking invaders. Raids became more frequent in the 830s and more penetrating. It may be significant that these developments coincided with the increasing degrees of social and political unrest in the affected Anglo-Saxon kingdoms. During the mid-800s AD, the main focus of Viking aggression was the Kingdom of West Francia. However, in the latter half of the century, there had been profound changes in Francia and England. In 862, the West Francian king, Charles, systematically began ramping up the defences of his kingdom. He had bridges built across the Seine and Loire to hinder passage of Viking ships, and he fortified towns and abbeys. Charles's defensive measures proved fruitful, and many Vikings began to concentrate instead on England. While Francia slowly stabilized, the British Isles were not able to overcome its political instability when the Great Heathen Army arrived in 865. We must also stress the importance of religion and religious life when discussing Anglo-Saxon vulnerability. In places that were frequently raided, the organization of the Christian Church was certainly disrupted. Long-established religious houses that were scattered throughout the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms were destroyed by Viking armies. Their communities were slaughtered or scattered, their books and other possessions burned or destroyed, their treasures looted, and their controlled lands were brought under secular control or taken over by force by the king. The quality of religious life in England had been affected not only by the Viking raids, but also by negligence and complacency. King Alfred believed that the raids were rather an effect than a cause of neglect and decline, asserting that the Vikings arrived because of God's displeasure with the Anglo-Saxon people. With the lack of sources about East Anglia, it is hard to assume why the easternmost Saxon kingdom was not able to resist the Viking invasion in various aspects. There is no evidence that supports a rise or decline of the kingdom during the 9th century. The only sources that are beneficial to us are records of the arrival of the Great Heathen Army in Kent. Here the Vikings plundered the land, even though a tribute, referred to as Danegeld, had been paid by the locals. The raiders continued moving further into East Anglia, which was currently ruled by King Edmund. Initially, there was no conflict between the Anglo-Saxons and the Great Heathen Army. The Vikings made their way to Edmund's court. They had superior forces, and they knew that the East Anglians had no option for resistance. The chronicler Aethelweard described that the Viking fleet was provided with food, money, and horses by King Edmund. The latter asset proved to be a fatal mistake, as the Viking army was now as mobile over land as it was by sea. Asser, the biographer of Alfred the Great, mentioned that almost the whole army was supplied with horses. The Vikings were now mobile enough to launch surprise attacks inland as unpredictably as their ships had allowed them to do on the coast. In the autumn of 869, the Vikings returned to East Anglia. They defeated Edmund in battle and killed him, which made the king a martyr. The Vikings installed a local Scandinavian ruler in the kingdom. Historians tend to assume that the shortage of sources on Northumbria in the 9th century, coupled with the conquest of the Vikings, must indicate that the kingdom was undergoing severe decline. Continuing disputes between rival claimants are noticeable, but we should stress the importance of the domination in this period of the family of Eardwulf, and the long reign of Eanred in particular. Since the 9th century, the Northumbrian coinage was in decline. After the gap of minting in the reigns of Eardwulf and Elfwald II, King Eanred produced a debased form of the Sciator coinage. The content of these silver coins was less than that of the Sciators, and only became further debased as the century progressed. By the reign of Ethelred II, coins were produced almost exclusively with the substantially less valuable metal of brass. If these economic indicators are anything to go by, then by the arrival of the Great Heathen Army, Northumbria was an unstable country, currently undergoing decline since the beginning of the century. After the death of King Offa, near the end of the 8th century, the kingdom of Mercia had begun to flounder. The power of the Mercian ealdormen grew to rival that of the Mercian kings, resulting in great friction between the royal house and the nobility, with only Kings Offa and Kenwulf able to maintain their authority. The next 6 years were followed by civil war, and gave East Anglian and West Saxon kings the opportunity to overthrow Mercian power. The loss of territory in this conflict made it harder for Mercia to increase its revenue. The reign of King Burgred saw its resources stretched even further when the Vikings attacked. As his reign progressed, it became clear that the Mercian defences and army were not able to contain the increasingly powerful Viking armies. While Northumbria and Mercia declined partly because of internal instability, Wessex was less impacted by civil war and claimant factions. The Kingdom of Wessex was reasonably successful against the Viking invaders. By the time the Great Heathen Army arrived, the West Saxons had already been fighting major campaigns against the Vikings for 14 years. Wessex was fortunate that the Vikings' priority was the conquest of northern England and of York in particular, but they still faced a substantial Danish threat and were almost fully overrun on several occasions. Facing this existential challenge, Wessex developed new strategies and increased the demands on their subjects in order to defeat the Vikings. One important innovation was the burh, or fortress, which could be used by the West Saxons for local refuge and as a base for militia to intercept Viking forces and disrupt their maneuverability. The dynamic and charismatic leadership of King Alfred the Great also played an important part in Wessex's independence. Alfred's victories against the Vikings on the battlefield, and his ability to be obeyed by his subjects in his struggle against the Scandinavians, is an important reason why the Vikings were not able to conquer Wessex. Ultimately, while the size and innovative prowess of the Viking army contributed to the rapid fall of most of Anglo-Saxon England, it was the political and economic decline of most of the English kingdoms that eventually led to their own downfall. If the 9th century was a period of stability and prosperity, it could be assumed that when the Great Heathen Army arrived in 865, all the kingdoms would be able to aid East Anglia against the Vikings. While Wessex was no exception from civil war in the 9th century, they did overcome their political unrest. With a far more stable economy than its rival petty kingdoms, Wessex was not forced to stretch its resources like Mercia, and had no decline in its coinage like Northumbria. Their previous experience fighting the Vikings, and not being a priority to the heathen horde in the 865 campaign, gives us further reasons as to why this more or less stable kingdom was able to maintain the integrity of its borders, while other kingdoms in England failed. It was mostly the problems the kings and their kingdoms faced that brings us to understand their incapabilities to fight off the Vikings. More videos on the Viking Age are on the way, so make sure to subscribe and press the bell button to see them. Recently, we have started releasing weekly Patreon and YouTube member exclusive videos. Join the ranks of patrons and YouTube members via the link in the description or by pressing the button under the video to watch these weekly videos, learn about our schedule, get early access to our videos, join our private Discord, and much more. Please consider liking, commenting, and sharing. It helps immensely. This is the Kings and Generals channel, and we will catch you on the next one.